In many ancient societies, violence defined honor, survival, and memory, shaping cultures where retaliation preserved dignity and refusing revenge invited shame, weakness, and eventual social disappearance. Because survival depended on responding to harm with equal force, forgiveness appeared irrational, dangerous, and destabilizing, threatening the social logic that kept order through fear and reciprocal violence. Welcome to Understanding Holy Systems, where we explore religions as they are revealed through their own sacred texts, and the systems of meaning believers build around them. Political authority in empires relied heavily on punishment, spectacle, and terror to enforce obedience across diverse populations lacking shared identity or internal loyalty. When forgiveness entered this environment, it removed fear from obedience, replacing visible coercion with inward moral restraint that could not be controlled through force alone. Early Christian communities possessed no armies, legal authority, or political institutions capable of resisting domination through conventional power or organized violence. Forgiveness, therefore, became an alternative form of agency, allowing powerless believers to preserve dignity, meaning, and inner freedom while remaining externally constrained. Oppressors expected hatred, rebellion, and resistance because retaliation confirmed their dominance and justified further repression in the name of security. Forgiveness denied this confirmation, disrupting the psychological cycle of domination by refusing to validate violence as necessary, effective, or morally successful. Public executions were designed to destroy movements by eliminating leaders and spreading terror, ensuring obedience through visible demonstrations of absolute authority. When victims forgave even in death, executions lost their finality, transforming punishment into testimony and extending influence beyond the grave. Blood feuds locked families and tribes into endless cycles of retaliation, guaranteeing that violence passed across generations without resolution or healing. Forgiveness interrupted these inherited cycles, halting escalation without armies, treaties, or laws, and stabilizing communities through restraint rather than force. Empires depended on predictable rebellion to justify surveillance, taxation, repression, and continual military expansion across conquered territories. Non-retaliation confused imperial logic, denying rulers the conflicts required to frame violence as necessary governance rather than naked domination. In honor-based cultures, weakness carried stigma, signaling failure, loss of status, and vulnerability to further exploitation. Christian forgiveness redefined suffering as spiritually meaningful, transforming weakness into moral authority rather than evidence of defeat. Normally, defeat erased legitimacy, silencing movements through fear, repression, and abandonment by followers seeking safety. Forgiveness reframed loss as victory, allowing belief systems to survive even when political success was impossible. Small, fragmented groups rarely survived sustained pressure from states, armies, and rival factions competing violently for resources. Shared forgiveness norms created internal cohesion, trust, and mutual care, increasing survival odds under persecution and instability. In most ancient societies, law depended on external enforcement through courts, punishments, and public penalties backed by visible political and military authority. Forgiveness shifted discipline inward, relocating control from courts and soldiers to conscience, belief, and internal moral self-regulation. Legal systems punished visible crimes that threatened order, stability, and authority, focusing on actions rather than intentions or inner life. Forgiveness expanded moral scrutiny inward, where thoughts, desires, and intentions became subject to guilt, reflection, and self-surveillance. Unmanaged guilt destabilized communities, producing fear, anxiety, resentment, and social tension that could erupt into violence or rebellion. Forgiveness made guilt bearable by offering release and restoration without requiring social or political transformation of existing hierarchies. Traditional justice sought immediate resolution to restore balance, deter future offenses, and visibly reaffirm authority. Forgiveness delayed confrontation, teaching patience and endurance while deferring conflict rather than resolving structural causes directly. Power historically ruled through punishment, fear, and exemplary violence designed to discourage resistance through spectacle and suffering. Mercy reframed authority as compassionate and moral, masking coercion behind benevolence and voluntary submission. Moral judgment once operated locally through families, tribes, customs, and shared traditions rather than centralized institutions. Forgiveness re-centralized moral authority within religious structures that claimed exclusive insight into conscience, sin, and redemption. Social anger historically fueled revolt, resistance, and collective action against injustice experienced as unbearable or illegitimate. Forgiveness redirected anger inward, transforming outward resistance into introspection, repentance, and prayer. Patience was elevated as a spiritual virtue, praised as maturity and faithfulness rather than passivity or delay. As patience replaced urgency, demands for immediate political or economic change weakened across believing communities. Material suffering often appeared meaningless within violent systems, offering no explanation or hope beyond survival. Forgiveness gave suffering cosmic meaning, framing pain as purposeful within a divine narrative rather than random injustice. Hierarchies generated resentment by concentrating power, protection, and privilege unevenly across social classes and groups. Humility reframed hierarchy morally, presenting submission as virtue rather than injustice requiring confrontation. In honor-based societies, obedience under domination risked appearing cowardly, inviting shame and further exploitation from those who valued strength and resistance. Forgiveness redefined obedience as imitation of Christ, transforming submission into a sacred act associated with holiness rather than weakness. Rulers consistently feared rebellion as an existential threat to order, legitimacy, taxation, and long-term political stability. By framing revolt as sin, forgiveness discouraged collective uprising and redirected loyalty towards spiritual obedience instead of political resistance. Persistent inequality required moral justification to prevent constant resistance from exploited and marginalized populations. Forgiveness emphasized moral equality before God, reducing pressure for material redistribution or structural reform. Under overwhelming imperial control, external freedom appeared unreachable through rebellion, reform, or negotiation. Inner freedom became sufficient, redefining liberation as spiritual peace rather than political or economic change. Cycles of revenge weakened societies through endless instability, loss of life, and destruction of trust. Forgiveness stabilized populations by interrupting retaliation and allowing communities to endure without constant violence. Repression required continuous force, surveillance and punishment, consuming resources and threatening legitimacy. Self-policing through conscience reduced enforcement needs, making control more efficient and less visibly violent. Uncontrolled rage threatened cohesion by encouraging reckless violence, sabotage, and social breakdown. Prayer absorbed rage into controlled ritual forms, channeling emotion away from disruptive action. Structural systems caused harm beyond individual intention through laws, hierarchies, incentives, and institutional design. Forgiveness shifted the blame game, putting moral responsibility on individuals instead of the system. History felt chaotic and unfair when suffering seemed pointless. A divine narrative brought order, showing that injustice is just a temporary part of a bigger plan. Accountability shook authority by revealing the corruption and abuse lurking in power structures, while final judgment pushed justice into the distant future. Resistance movements often required clear enemies to focus anger, organize solidarity, and justify sacrifice against identifiable sources of harm and injustice. Forgiveness blurred enemy boundaries, dissolving moral clarity and weakening the emotional fuel required for sustained collective resistance. When guilt became universal, moral distinctions softened, reducing outrage toward rulers, elites, and institutions benefiting from inequality. Shared sinfulness flattened moral hierarchies while allowing political and economic hierarchies to remain largely untouched and operational. Waiting for divine justice became spiritually rewarded, reframing delay as faithfulness rather than failure to act. As waiting was praised, urgent action appeared impulsive, dangerous, or spiritually immature within believing communities. The initial shock of forgiveness violated norms, expectations, and habits that structured violence and honor-based social order. Over time, repeated forgiveness normalized disruption, transforming a radical refusal into expected moral behavior. A resistance ethic rooted in refusal gradually lost sharpness as it was formalized into teachings, rituals, and institutions. Governance ethics emerged, using forgiveness to stabilize populations rather than challenge power directly. Institutions required durable moral frameworks to survive crises, succession, conflict, and generational change. Forgiveness provided cohesion, loyalty, and shared meaning that bound individuals to institutions and communities. Radical refusal once exposed domination by denying participation in violence, revenge, and coercion. Expected forgiveness later enforced conformity, marking refusal to forgive as moral failure rather than resistance. Power learned to speak religious language, adopting forgiveness rhetoric to legitimize authority and soften domination. As rulers absorbed this language, religion lost exclusive control over moral critique and disruption. Violence had once been exposed as empty, self-consuming, and incapable of producing lasting justice. Forgiveness later organized society by channeling behavior, obedience, restraint, and patience into stable patterns. The same ethic that shattered domination at its origin undermined the necessity of violence as social glue. Over time, that ethic also preserved order, disciplining emotion and stabilizing systems long after its radical shock faded.